Okay, welcome to the Friday Transportation Seminar at Portland State University. Today we are going to continue our kind of topic from last week, the cyclist at signalized intersections. So this week we'll have Thompson, one of our own civil engineering students, to talk about cyclist compliance at signalized intersections. Okay, with that, I will turn over to Sam.
All right, thanks, Dr. Wang. Hi, again, my name's Sam Thompson, and I'll be presenting on the makings of my thesis, which I'm currently working on. So I'm going to give you a little background of kind of like how I came to doing this for my thesis, and what it's all about, and then some very preliminary sort of results, and talk a little bit about things that I am currently working on but cannot yet present on. So first of all, I think it's important to talk about why study cyclist compliance. Aside from the fact that it's probably really intuitive that compliance with traffic control devices is important for efficient and safe operation of our system, I think studying bicyclist compliance specifically is important for a couple of different reasons. First, it's a growing mode of utilitarian travel, so the number of bicycle trips has been increasing in the last several years. And this is coupled with a decline in car use by younger generations. There's also room for further growth in this respect. So in the last decade or so, we've seen an increase in the bicycle friendliness of transportation policy. Namely, there is a lot more funding for bicycle-specific projects, and there's a lot more ability for jurisdictions to flex funding to bicycle-specific projects as well. And there's also a large percentage of trips that are bikeable, or under 3 miles. So I definitely do this sometimes, but if you think about, if you're like, oh, I really need to go to the store, and so you like hop in your car really quick and you drive like a mile or a couple of blocks just to get something from the grocery store really quick. And those are trips under 3 miles that are definitely able to be switched to biking instead of driving or potentially another mode. So there are opportunities for increases in cycling. There's also, because of increased interest and also increases in funding for transportation project, there has been an expansion of the bicycle network. So with more bicycling capacity, there's also room for further growth in bicycling. With that, little is known about the actual rates of compliance for cyclists. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence. Most of it is fairly negative. And it's pretty well documented, the perceptions of cyclists by other road users, namely motorists. Motorists have been documented saying things like cyclists are renegade, or maybe instilled with a sense of bravado, and non-compliant behaviors. Something relevant to this study would be red light running. And red light running is seen as a pervasive cyclist behavior, something that all cyclists do, that's really annoying for motorists. And this is something that's been documented in the literature. But empirical evidence about the rates of cyclist compliance or non-compliance, specifically at signalized intersections, is pretty non-existent, in the United States. So that's a reason to look at cyclist compliance. Another reason is in the MUTCD, which for those of you who might be unfamiliar, is the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. And that book it's just a giant book that has all of our transportation devices, and it has specifications for how they should be used and what they should look like. So in order for a transportation device to be put in the MUTCD, it's important to know how road users interact with that device. Like, do they comply with it specifically? So that's another important reason to study cyclist compliance at signalized intersections, specifically signalized intersections with bicycle signals. So my study is not born purely of interest, purely out of interest for bicycle compliance is actually part of a smaller study that I did with ODOT out of PSU called bicycle-specific or operational guidance for bicycle-specific traffic signals. And so there were two parts to the study. In the first part, we did a state of the practice where we looked at the locations and the characteristics of bicycle signals across North America, mostly in the United States. And I have a map right here of all of those locations, which is sorely outdated now because bicycle signals have been popping up all over the United States. And if you are unsure of what a bicycle signal is, you can see here's a bunch of examples of different indications that we found in that state of the practice survey. So the second part of the study had to do with cyclist performance and cyclist compliance. And we were specifically looking to see if cyclists comply with bicycle-specific signals, if they understand what they're for, what the meaning of the device is, and how does that compliance compare to compliance for cyclists at signalized intersections where there are traditional traffic signals. So the disclaimer is that the data that was collected in this project is not necessarily representative of all cyclists in Oregon or even Portland, because the intersections we chose, many of them had bicycle signals, and the other traditional signal intersections were chosen for their high bicycle volumes. So just keep that in mind when I'm presenting the results. Okay, so let's get into the data collection. There were two sources. I guess I'm supposed to stand over here because the lighting's better. Keep moving around. There are two sources. So the first came from the city of Portland, and it was from a previous study on bicycle signals. And so there are 3 intersections, and they all had bicycle-specific signals. And then the next 4 intersections we collected using a different video data method. You can sort of see the different views of our video data there. And my colleague Kirk Paulson in the back helped. He was part of this, and so we went and set up cameras and videotaped cyclists at these other intersections. And this is where we brought in some of the intersections with traditional traffic signals. So cyclist compliance is a pretty broad topic, and obviously this presentation is about cyclists at signalized intersections, but we wanted to be really specific about what exactly we're looking at with compliance. And so we're looking at whether or not cyclists are complying with the red indication. So we tried to narrow our data set so there was a limited amount of variation in that. So we only collected cyclists that were arriving on a red indication, and we only collected cyclists that were utilizing the bicycle infrastructure. We didn't want to have to worry about do we say a cyclist compliance if they're using the PED signal, but they're on the sidewalk, or they're using the regular signal, but they're coming from the sidewalk or taking the lane. And we didn't want to have to worry about all that. We wanted our results to be pretty straightforward. So we have only cyclists that are utilizing the bike infrastructure before and after the intersection, arriving on red. And so we have this example here of a cyclist waiting and continuing through the intersection in the bike infrastructure. So we collected 3 different types of data. The first type is descriptive, and you can see from the graphic sort of some of the different types of things we looked at. Clothing, bike type, perceived sex of the person, whether or not they were carrying any cargo. And cargo, we said if they had a backpack, all the way to if they were one of those like beeline cyclists with the big electric cargo truck. So cargo is a pretty wide range. If there were other cyclists there, if there were cars in the adjacent lane, things like that to sort of describe the cyclist and the situation when they were arriving at the signal. We also collected event type data, so we have when the signal turns green, how long they waited, and then we had some other timed events that corresponded to an analysis we did on cyclist acceleration as well. And then we had the compliance-specific data, which is basically if they were compliant or not, and if they were not compliant, we sort of broke out the non-compliance into a couple different categories. So these are the categories: gap accepted and signal jump. And so I have some examples, just like quick videos to sort of be explicit about what those mean. So here we have two examples of gap accepted. Oh, there's sound. So we have the cyclist here just going straight through the signal, not stopping, which was counted as gap accepted. And then here we have a cyclist waiting for the cross traffic to clear, and then continuing through the intersection. And I just have no idea who that cyclist could be that's being so non-compliant in those videos. It's definitely not me. And then we have an example of a signal jumper, which is basically someone who arrives at the red indication and basically waits for it to almost turn green and then goes. So you can see the video cuts off, but you can see that this indication turned green before the cyclist finished crossing the intersection. That was a little more extreme example of a signal jump, but just so you get an idea of what those mean. So hit you with the quick results. We had over 2,500 cyclists and an overall compliance rate of almost 90%. And so you can see we broke out the non-compliance down into the couple of different types. And then we have an other category, and that's just 3 cyclists that went out into traffic and actually stopped traffic, so they didn't really accept a gap. But you know, so that's what that is when you see like the little sliver of other in there. That's what those are. And so to compare this to other modes really quickly, in literature I found that pedestrians had a non-compliance rate of about 16%, and this is for them just walking against the red hand indication. And this is like pretty comparable to cyclists who are accepting a gap and signal jumping in our study. So if you combine those numbers, about 8% of cyclists in our study were non-compliant, compared to 16%. And the motorist movement that is most analogous to gap accepted in our study is red light running. And motorists run the red light at a much lower rate than cyclists, 1.3%. In our study, it was about 4.5%. So just to put those in context. So we have some quick, very descriptive results, and I just want to explain kind of what's going on here in some of these graphs. So on the bottom here, we have 2 categories, and then we have a percent on the y-axis. And so basically, each of these columns represents 100% of the sample that fits into either of those categories. So in both of these, cyclists, about 90% of cyclists that arrived at an intersection without a bike signal, and about 90% of cyclists that arrived at an intersection with a bike signal were non-compliant in some fashion. The important takeaway from this slide is that the overall compliance rate at intersections with the 2 differing types of signals is not that different. So here I have a graph of the 7 different intersections that we have in our study. And as you can see, there is a pretty wide, there's a lot of variation in compliance, either the type of non-compliance or the overall amount from location to location. And so later I'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing to explore why it might be different from location to location. So presence of cargo, we talked about this a little bit earlier. And so cargo, the percentage of people that were non-compliant that were carrying cargo was significantly different than the percentage of people that were non-compliant that were not carrying any cargo. And this could be for a variety of reasons. Like I said, these are descriptive, so all we know is that they had cargo or not. And it could be maybe that people carrying a heavier load didn't want to stop, and so they wanted to push through the intersection, or maybe they wanted to get a head start. Maybe they were commuters. Commuters are pretty likely to have some cargo, and they're anxious to get home at the end of the day. Maybe a lot of these were taken during the PM peak. So it's hard to say definitively why it is that cyclists with cargo the percentage, they were more likely to be non-compliant. So helmet use is an interesting one. We saw that the proportion of cyclists that weren't wearing a helmet was significantly higher than the proportion of cyclists that were non-compliant, that were wearing a helmet. And I think this points towards sort of a risk-taking behavior. You could think of the practice of not wearing a helmet as being inherently more risky than wearing a helmet. And then you also have a greater proportion of these cyclists participating in a gap-accepted type of non-compliance. And going between two cars is probably the most risky type of behavior that we have in this study. We also looked at compliance by peak period, and I think it doesn't look this way from the chart, but I believe that the proportion of non-compliant cyclists in the off-peak was significantly greater than those in the AM and PM peak. And this could be potentially because of cross-traffic or because of other reasons. Maybe the intersections that we recorded at had sight, like visibility restrictions. Similar to some of these other graphs, is hard to say. So we have compliance by wait time. So this is a graph of only the non-compliant cyclists. And one of our hypotheses was that cyclists would come to the intersection and stop and wait for a little bit and then be like, I'm tired of waiting, I'm going to continue on through the intersection. And as this graph shows, our data did not support that hypothesis. You can see here that the majority of cyclists that were accepting a gap in traffic actually barely waited any time at all before deciding to go on through the intersection. And it's not really clear from this graph, but the vast majority of those didn't wait at all. They're in the 0-second wait time, and they just blew through the intersection. And I think that is also something that points towards risk-taking behavior in a excuse me, in a smaller subset of cyclists. So the last graph we have here is a little complicated. So we have cross-traffic on the x-axis increasing, and we have a ratio on the y-axis. And basically, we took the ratio of the accepted gap to the hypothetical time that it would take them to cross the intersection. So we have the headway between cars that were crossing the path of the cyclists over the bicycle crossing time, which we derived from an equation in the Ashto bike book, the bicycle crossing time equation, and we plugged in the width of the intersection that at which the cyclist was observed, and some default values for acceleration and speed to kind of come up with the hypothetical time it would take them to cross. So what this graph is showing is that cyclists that have a ratio of 1, or where the ratio is 1, means that they accepted a gap that was just big enough for them to completely cross the intersection. And as you can see, there are a lot of ratios that are less than 1 that were observed. And so that means that cyclists were in the intersection at some point when a car was crossing their path, either behind them or in front of them. And so they're effectively sort of weaving through traffic. And they're not waiting for the intersection to be completely clear while they're crossing. So quick outcomes, observed compliance rate of about 90%. An important takeaway is that compliance at bicycle signals was comparable to that at traditional signals, and also that cyclists seem to understand, comprehend what a bicycle means and how to behave regarding the bicycle signal. So what do these descriptive results mean for continuing work? So with a lot of those graphs, I talked about the different factors that could make, like with cargo, for instance, like what are the different reasons that a cyclist with cargo, or that proportion, was greater than cyclists without cargo. And so there are a lot of different reasons for that, and descriptive analysis doesn't control for the different characteristics of the cyclists and the characteristics of the intersection. And so we need to do a more robust analysis that controls for some of those factors, and we can look more specifically at the choice of a cyclist to be non-compliant and how it's affected by each of those individual factors. And so, oh, and then also we have the risk-taking profile that's sort of emerging of non-compliant cyclists. So we have cyclists that are not wearing a helmet and do not appear to be influenced by wait time, and are also accepting very small gaps relative to the amount of time it would hypothetically take them to even cross the intersection. And so my continuing work looks to explore those types of things a little bit further. So in order to address the first two bullets in this list, I've embarked on a modeling effort. And so I have some like really preliminary sort of results that don't have any numbers attached to them. But you can sort of look at some of the sort of the trend that goes with some of the different variables. So for instance, we have the number of cyclists already waiting. And so basically this graph, this is 1. And so anything that goes to this side has a negative effect on gap acceptance. So people are more likely to be compliant. And then if it goes this way, people are more likely to be non-compliant. And this is only for cyclists that are accepting a gap in traffic. So with the number of cyclists already waiting, we can see that there's a pretty negative effect on whether or not a cyclist will accept a gap in traffic. And I think this makes a lot of sense because if you already have cyclists waiting there, they might be in the way of you just going through the intersection. And you might also feel some sort of peer pressure to be compliant if those people are already waiting. So that's just an example. Cyclists that were identified as female were also less likely to be non-compliant. Cross-traffic squared had a very small but significant, in this analysis, a very small but significant effect on compliance. And basically the cross-traffic squared variable in the model looks at the nonlinear relationship between compliance and cross-traffic. So it's sort of like looking at the behavior of cyclists that are like, yes, I will go through the intersection until cross-traffic gets so high, and then the amount of non-compliance really drops off at some sort of peak or higher value of cross-traffic. And then lastly, the lack of helmet was the single most explanatory factor for whether or not a cyclist would be non-compliant. And so this isn't saying that that the lack of a helmet makes cyclists non-compliant. I think it's indicative of the type of cyclist that is more likely to be risk-taking. And so that brings me to the next part of my continued work, which is the cyclist survey. And so I've got an example cyclist here. You know, what makes her tick? I don't know. She looks a little punky. She's got that jean jacket with the patch on it or something. But so basically I'm doing a little survey of cyclists where they have these little individual postcards that they've gotten, and they go online and they answer questions regarding their personality type. And so we're looking at sensation and risk-taking behaviors, aggression, which is something that has been shown to be correlated with motorist non-compliant behavior, anxiety and worry, like maybe how much they worry about being in an accident or getting a ticket, something like that. And then we also look at justifications, like will someone be more likely to be non-compliant if they are in a hurry, or if they see someone else violate the signal before them. And so we asked respondents a series of questions about whether or not they would justify being non-compliant in a specific situation like that. There are also pictures of different intersection types, and we asked respondents to sort of divulge whether or not they would be likely to be non-compliant or run the red light at the pictured intersection, and then what are the reasons why they would or would not. And then we have some quick demographics, and these are a little bit different than the standard because we're looking at people and their job flexibility. Like, do you have a non-flexible work environment where you definitely have to be on time? You get points against you if you're late. Are you more flexible? Do you have children and familial responsibilities that maybe make you want to be more safe, and maybe that's something you equate with being compliant? So looking at some of those sort of characteristics of cyclists, in addition to how much they cycle, how comfortable they are bicycling, and other modes that they take. And I unfortunately can't present any results from that because the sample is not very high yet. But the end goal is to sort of group respondents into several different types of cyclists. So maybe we'll have cyclists who are largely middle-aged and have children and have been in an accident and are worried about getting in another one, and they will only justify being non-compliant for certain reasons and are pretty unlikely to be non-compliant at different types of intersections. And so I'm hoping to identify different groups of cyclists that kind of fit into little silos such as that with the end data. So stay tuned. I'll probably be writing a paper on that in addition to my thesis. So I would like to acknowledge the Oregon DOT Technical Advisory Committee who advised the original ODOT project, OTREC and ODOT for funding the original project. My advisor, Dr. Monsier, Dr. Filiosi, my colleague Kirk Paulson, and then all of the potential takers of my survey, hopefully. And so if you want to look at the interim ODOT report or any other presentations or the paper on the state of the practice review or our bicycle acceleration and speed data paper, you can go to that little link, and all of that stuff is there. And I'm happy to answer some questions.
Wayne Corrick, Civil Engineering. What did weather factor into any of your, weather conditions factor into any of your study?
We did record the weather, and I would love to evaluate the effects of weather. But in our video data, we mostly had really good weather, so there wasn't enough variation to really look at that empirically. That is something that I'm asking about in the survey to hopefully find out if cyclists are more likely to be non-compliant if it's raining really hard and they just want to get home, something like that. But no results yet.
Ilya Solovyev, I just want to clarify, so you had 7 intersections, is that right, that you were looking at?
Mm-hmm.
And did all of them had the traffic light for bicyclists, or some of them not specifically had one? So it's just like if the car would drive, or if the bicyclist would come up to an intersection, and if it's not specifically designed for bicyclists, so they would never turn probably green, so he would just run the red light.
I see. The intersections where we looked at the traditional signals, they did have loop detectors and that sort of thing that were geared for cyclists because there was enough cyclist volume going through those intersections. So that wasn't an issue. But that is another thing that I ask about in the survey, actually, which I think is a pretty intuitive thing. If a cyclist comes up and has to wait forever or has to wait for a car to come and trigger the signal for them, or they would have to get off their bike, maybe that's a situation that a lot of people would justify running through a red light. So that's something I ask about. It's a good point.
Andy Kading, student. I was wondering what percentage of the cyclists that you sampled had cargo in general?
That is a good question, and I don't know the answer to it. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Amy Huddleston, Civil Engineering. I remember you saying that you discounted all the, or didn't use the data from people who weren't on the infrastructure for the bicycle specifically. Mm-hmm. One of the complaints that bicyclists hear is that they don't act like cars, that they're often, being a pedestrian when it suits them. Are you ever going to take some of that data and see and factor that into compliance and how bicyclists behave?
Are you asking if I plan on doing another study on whether
Oh,
or
no,
not
not
people
you, but can they use that data for that kind of information? Because that's interesting, I think.
to sort of like glean like what percentage of cyclists are actually utilizing the infrastructure, and what are the ways that they're maybe getting around using a light or yeah, I mean, I think that would be a potential use of the same video. I mean, obviously there's a very large sample. I think the problem with doing a study like that is, you know, in order to have like meaningful results, you really have to narrow down what you're looking for. And so I think you would just have to narrowly define like what are the different behaviors that you're looking for that are, I don't know, that's like getting on the sidewalk is only non-compliant in certain parts of Portland, so you'd have to really define what you're looking for there. But yeah, I think it's possible. So.
John Landolph. I'm wondering, either in your literature review or in your surveys, did you explore at all kind of cross-referencing with other areas of non-compliance on the road, such as, you know, probably more than 1 in 10 people who are driving might be texting or might drive home from the bar, and that might include, in fact, you know, some of the cyclists. You know, when they're using another mode. Were any of those other behaviors explored at all?
You mean in literature? Did I look at
In the literature review or in the survey questions?
Oh, okay. First, in the literature, yeah, I did look at some of that. I didn't present that just because it wasn't as analogous to the same types of behaviors. An example off the top of my head is those dynamic right turn, no right turn on red signs that they have that will flash on, and like almost 50% of motorists in one particular study I found were non-compliant with those. And I mean, I think speeding is another great example where motorists are pretty non-compliant and cyclists don't really have the option to be non-compliant in that way. So if we're looking at overall, yeah, non-compliance, there's definitely a lot of variation with motorists. And then in the survey, we do actually ask about different risk-taking behaviors when people are biking, if they're like using a cell phone, not wearing a helmet, and then we also ask about them if people are driving, texting, wearing a seatbelt. I really wanted to ask questions about drinking and driving and drinking and biking, but we had to cut down the survey a little bit, but I think that would be another interesting risk-taking behavior to evaluate.
Jared, USP. I was just wondering if cyclists are treated the same as motorists when it comes to traffic violations and fining them.
I don't really have definitive, like, new evidence, you know, like I can't like really say. I would say probably not. It seems that enforcement of cyclist noncompliance is not as great, but I don't actually have any. Maybe someone else in the audience has looked at that, but I can't say for sure. I would say it was probably less.
I think if a policeman saw a violation, they would get it, but they just don't. The opportunities are not as fast as for the cars because there's more cars than there are bikes.
Yeah. I'll put myself out there and say that about a month ago, on my route, there's a stop sign where I turn onto Broadway to go across the bridge, and I always run it. And there was a police officer right there, and he watched several of us just go through, because unless there are bikes coming, there's no conflict.
But they also had a sting there off bikes by cops. I saw it in the newspaper.
Oh, they did? It was probably because that officer... Oh, okay. Oh, well, I'm very lucky then, because he yelled at several of us, and we just continued biking. So that led me to believe they weren't very keen on enforcing, but maybe they are. Thank you.
Do you have any examples or ideas of how this data could be used to improve compliance and safety of bicyclists?
Yeah, I think there are probably like 3 different ways that it could be used, or the results could be used. So I think Firstly, looking at some of the modeling outcomes, looking at the intersection types, and some of the things that cyclists report where they would be more likely to be non-compliant. I think that that information would provide opportunities for like enforcement at different sorts of places. And I think that some of the information from the survey about like risk-taking attitudes and sort of identifying like types of people and potentially like ages and genders of people that are more compliant or less compliant in particular ways could help inform like educational like campaigns if you wanted to have like a campaign to increase compliance at a specific location or in general. I said 3 ways, didn't I? I thought of another way too. I'm gonna have to get back to you on the 3rd way, but there's 2.
Gabriel Russo, USP grad. Did your study find incline-decline or general topographic features to be an indicator for cyclist behavior? For example, a cyclist's velocity, or anything like that?
Yeah, again, similar to weather, we had mostly flat grades for all of our intersections. So from the video data, that's not something that we'll be able to look at. But again, that is something I ask about in the survey. Excuse me. So I ask about losing inertia. So if you've got, if you're getting going really good, like you don't really want to stop, or maybe if you have stopped at several stoplights previous to that one, whether or not you would be more or less likely to be non-compliant. I think both of those have to do with inertia and keeping up that kinetic energy.
Aiza Malik, you mentioned that the survey was still in the initial stages, but I was wondering what kind of response rate the survey was generating, if people are interested in answering the questions or not.
It's not very high yet. I'm kind of embarrassed to say, but I have not passed out that many surveys. It's probably less than 20%, which I guess is not atypical for a survey. But I haven't actually looked at what the actual percentage is. I just know like how many responses I've gotten and about how many surveys I've given out. So.
Michael Schomburg, Anthropology. I was looking at your data collection with at cameras, looking at bikers tend to use similar routes repeatedly. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if there's a lot of kind of repeat individuals going through there, and if there's any way to kind of mitigate that. Maybe would you be interested in more qualitative longitudinal studies with groups of individuals and how that would play into your research?
Yeah, I think we didn't account for that in our data collection or reduction, but some of the intersections we only did for 1 day, so that wouldn't really be an issue. Some of the other intersections, specifically some of the older data that we had, we did do multiple days at the same intersection, and I didn't personally watch that data, so I can't say if I recognize that there were repeat cyclists, but I do think that that's a valid point. It would be interesting to look at groups of cyclists and maybe because I think the cycling culture is another thing that really plays into people's individual choice to be compliant or non-compliant. So if you're on the same route every day and you see similar people, I know I see similar people on the same route, are you more or less likely to be influenced by what those people think about you since you see them every day? Or there's some research with motorists and I guess road users of all kinds from the UK, and they talk about sort of their justifications for being non-compliant. If you're more familiar with the area and maybe you feel like some of the traffic restrictions are for people that are outside, like outsiders, that you're less likely to be compliant with them because you kind of have a sense of ownership over that route or that neighborhood. So I do think that doing a longitudinal study would be interesting for that reason.
Hi, Brian Davis. It looked from your data like there was a few intersections that had a good bit more of the signal jumping cyclists than others, particularly where there was no bike-specific signal. And I'm wondering if there might be if you notice maybe a particularly acute right hook conflict at those intersections, and if a potential way to reduce that non-compliance would be to do a bike signal with some kind of leading interval to kind of assuage concerns about that right hook.
Let me scroll up to that slide and look at which ones they were exactly. Let's see. So the one at 18th and Pearl in Eugene, and so the signal at Broadway Williams in Portland already has a bicycle signal specifically for the right hook, mitigation of the right hook conflict. And that's not something that we noticed with the other two intersections. That wasn't something we noted that, oh, there's a big right hook conflict. I think, yeah, I'm not really sure. Like I said, there could be a lot of different reasons why cyclists might be jumping the signal. It could be the time of day that we recorded some of these people. For instance, for Eugene at the 18th and Pearl intersection, those were mostly people in the PM peak. So maybe those folks are interested in getting home a little sooner, and so they're quick to get up on their bike before the signal turns green. But yeah, I can't say that there's overwhelming evidence of a right hook or anything like that.
Yeah, at the Broadway and Williams one, there's the part-time restriction sign that comes up for the right turn, and so the cyclists are getting sort of a prior indication that the signal's about to turn green for them. So a lot of that jump there was just people sort of knowing that they're going to get the green next. And probably the same thing at Beaverton and Eugene. They just, they can see the yellow indication for the conflicting direction, and so they're moving ahead before they actually get the green. And I think, yeah, Beaverton Lombard's fairly low volume on the cross traffic, but the 18th and Pearl has a lot of volume. So
yeah,
we weren't really, able to sort of, the primary thing we were looking at is sort of bike signal and not bike signal, and we weren't really able to completely untangle all of the individual geometrics of all the intersections. Yeah. In Andy, we had the 65% of the cyclists had cargo, but they were only in the second sample. The new data we collected cargo. The old data from the Portland sample, we didn't collect whether they had cargo or not. So it was only about half the sample.
Thanks.
So what age range did you include in your data?
We categorized age, so we had categories 1, 2, and 3. 1 being young, so they looked like they were below 18. Middle age, which is up to age 50 or 60, and then older. And I didn't do a lot of analysis with age, just because from the video data, it was really hard to determine people's gender or their age. So all age ranges were included. There was definitely a heavy majority were the middle age, the age 2 category.
Yeah, I was interested in knowing your take on requiring bicyclists to maybe take the written part of the license test, since they're sharing the road and they're expected to obey a lot of those same signals. What's your take on maybe doing that?
I mean, I do think it would be useful for cyclists to know the rules of the road. Motorists are supposed to know how to. I just recently took the motorist driving test for Oregon, and motorists are supposed to know how to behave around bike boxes and bike lanes, and not merge into them to make a right-hand turn, which is a big pet peeve of mine. And that's in the written test. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not opposed to that. I think that would be hard to regulate since we're not giving out licenses for cycling, and cycling is also something that children do, and so then you're asking people to bring their children in to take a test, or you have to make an age range.
Particularly for people who use it on the road, sharing the road, whereas
Sharing a road as opposed to a bike lane?
Or no, not even a bike lane. I guess I'd consider like children usually not really commuting, you know, or I guess, yeah, that'd be kind of a hard part in regulating it. But I meant specifically people who are commuting, you know, on bicycles, like maybe a certain mileage per day or something like that. But
yeah.
I guess that would be kind of hard to prove. So
yeah, so I think although the logistics of that are very tricky, hypothetically, I think that's a good idea because people are more aware of what they're supposed to do and what the right way to behave on the roadway is. So.
Jacob Hansen, undergrad. I was wondering, did you look into the rate of injuries at intersections where there were a lot of gap-accepted and signal jumps like Broadway and Williams?
That is not something I have looked at yet, but I do plan on looking at that to get some more background for my thesis. Good question.
Wes Bevins, you just said that you hated when motorists merged into the bike lane to turn right. How would you expect them to make that right turn?
You're supposed to wait until cyclists go through.
So you're saying they didn't wait, but whenever you cross that lane, you're merging,
right?
Whether you wait or not.
I guess I was referring to when motorists like merge in and then drive down the bike lane and then.
Occupied bike lane would be a better term.
Yeah, probably.
So did you look at all at the length of the signal phase or cycle in relation to compliance? Because like sometimes it seems like a really long light. You wait, you wait, you wait. Okay, I'm going to go. Yeah.
I did not look at the relationship between the cycle length, but I did look at the wait time. And then I had a graph up there about that people seemed if they were going to wait for a certain amount of time, they were likely to just continue waiting until the signal turned green or until right before it turned green to go. But I didn't specifically look at cycle length versus compliance. But I do think that's interesting because it gets into accommodation of cyclists and possibly, that goes back to the third way that we could use the data. Great question. So commonly, signals are coordinated for motorists, so they can get several greens in a row. And I think it's incredibly frustrating as a cyclist when the signal cycles are not timed and you have to stop at every light. And so no, we did not specifically look at that. But I think that's a way that we could influence design a little bit if we wanted to increase compliance. One way would be to be more accommodating of cyclists, and they might be more willing to comply at signals that are more accommodating.
I would just probably throw out the question is, given that you have the cameras installed there, are you would the data collection will be a continuing effort, or is it just just for this study and stuff?
They were temporary installations. So we took them out and put them up for several days or several hours and then took them down. So they're no longer up at those locations.
Because some of the questions come up with how, weather, and some other factors maybe.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's a longer effort, it's probably help answer some of those questions.
Yeah, that would.
Okay, if not, no more questions, just thank Sam for